I was sent the book, Trevor McDonald, An Improbable Life, only a couple of days ago, and I thought I won't be able to finish it, but I'll get through as much as I can. Do you know what? Just the second paragraph of the preface would have been enough to have a whole conversation, because it's where you do the quote from Roger Cohen from the New York Times with the phrase, truths are many, which
Yes.
it just seems the perfect point to start talking about everything that's happening in the world at the moment.
Exactly. Well, for people like you and me in this trade, truths are many, and we constantly have this battle of trying to decipher what is real and what is not. What are the facts and what are alternative facts, and it's a constant struggle. And it appealed to me because in all my career, I've always found that to be very, very, very true. Some I got right, some I got terribly wrong, but that battle never ceased.
There seems to me to be two. I've always thought that there are two cliches that cause more trouble than any others in the world of public opinion and politics. One is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which we've seen be disastrous on a number of occasions. And the other is, if you don't stand with us, you stand against us. Because
yes,
no, it mustn't be like that. I don't have to agree with you. I don't have to hate you to disagree with you. And the polarization of opinion in this particular point in history, I think is terrifying.
No, I think you're totally right. And in the system which we all praise, the democratic system, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes we win and sometimes we lose. And the kind of core of what is supposed to be the system which we all praise and enjoy living under is that we must learn to accept what those decisions are. And it's a lesson that we've all had to learn to live with.
Well, okay. On a much more personal level, there's something that fascinated me very early on in the book. You talked about your upbringing in Trinidad. Now, this is my opinion of the West Indies, of the attitude of the West Indies, as someone who was born in the north of England and then moved to London and has been to the Western. I've been there once, to Antigua. But my opinion is that when you're a young man in grown up in the West Indies, you have this wonderful laid back attitude, and you think, this is I'm living in a paradise. I'm living in a beautiful country. The weather is beautiful. There's beautiful food to be had. I'm just going to relax and revel in this wonderful laid back attitude. And to even bother lifting yourself out of that must take an effort of extreme will. In fact, I'm 100% wrong, aren't I?
Well, you're not. There's a lot to be said for that, and the glories of sun, sea, and all that warm climate, and not having to go through January and February and March and winter in a cold climate. All these things are absolutely wonderful. My problem was, I use the word advisedly, was I was pushed by my parents to do otherwise. There's something more philosophical before I talk about my parents about it. People who live in small islands, a long way away from the metropolitan centers of the world, they're not naturally introspective. They look outwards. And my parents constantly admonish me to look outwards. You had to be the best in school. You had to be, to follow everybody else who wanted to be doctors and lawyers and who wanted to be trained in either the United States or in Oxford or Cambridge. And this is the way we were brought up. We were brought up not to look at the glories of what you rightly describe as sun and sea and warmth, but we were encouraged to look beyond that. And, London was a great part of what our lives were about. It was the metropolitan center. It was where everything happened. Washington and New York and all these places gleamed in the distance as something that you must aspire to. And that's really been the story of my life. We will never. I always thought, in my later life, my parents were educating me or insisting on my education so that in the end I could actually leave the West Indies. And so, bitter or sad, whatever it was, but that was the story.
And it is a wonderful story, and you tell it also, you tell it in a way that it's like you were brought up to look at the people who were just relaxing and getting by in life, but no, this is how you could end up if you don't work hard.
Yes.
Which is...
You're absolutely right. And I mean, you make a very good point, because my mother, who was a very stern observer of everything that I did, I mean, she would look at people and she'd say, you look at that man, you see, he hasn't done terribly well, and look at what his life has become. And yet there's Mr. John there, his boy is studying medicine in Edinburgh or in Oxford or in London. And so, you were always given the choice of what your life was going to be. Do you want to be like those who achieve nothing, or do you want to be, and I mean, I say, do you want to be? We were pushed into being, somebody who wanted to do much, much better.
It does paint, like I say, I'm only about 3 or 4 chapters in, so the spoiler alerts, obviously, because I want to, but it already paints, I mean, it's a biography, but it's autobiography, but there's so much in it that's like a lovely novel. You talk about your early days at the Trinidad radio station, and one of the lovely things which just strikes me as the most beautiful scene in a film is the company made money, just like regional newspapers in this country.
Yes.
If you're going to report on a wedding, make sure you name everyone who was there, because they'll all buy a copy.
Exactly.
With the radio, it was the death column after
the death announcements. Yes, I know. I have never lost because I'm probably totally wrong about this, but I don't know, now that you mention it, I don't know anywhere else in the world where that sort of thing happened with the persistence and with the urgency that it happened for us. And people who there is a great ceremony about death and so on and people's passing in small countries. They're very small, people know each other, but people wanted to know what was going on, and so they played a very important part in the lives of radio listeners. What fascinated me was that people were desperately keen that you got all the names pronounced correctly and that you made absolutely sure that you mentioned all those who were living in Canada or living in New York or in Tampa, Florida, or in Los Angeles. It was almost as though your passage to the next world was enhanced if you had relatives who were living abroad, because we had to. And I have been in the radio station on mornings when people stormed in and saying, you didn't pronounce the name of my relative in Canada correctly, and I don't know, you pick on something which is always, and I can't explain it in any other way, but that it was a kind of way of keeping the community together. It was a small, terribly small island, Trinidad, where I was brought up, had a population of just over 1 million in my day. So that's terribly small, and it was very intimate. And these things were, rites of passage, really, and you had to do them properly.
It was a very exciting time though when you first started in the radio station, for instance, because it was at the time of independence, wasn't it?
That's right. I got the chance to come to cover the Independence Conference in London in 1962. It was the big break for me. I'd never been so far out of the country by then. And it was an extraordinary experience to be able to give them the chance to do that. And I really enjoyed it. And it was a great it was a great fillip to what I would do later on in life.
So was London the place? I mean, because geographically it's America, isn't it? The Miami, I guess, is the nearest landfall, or is it sort of Central America geographically that is the nearest to Trinidad?
Yes.
Is that where people were drawn to, or was it the old country? You know, because you'd been part of the. You're a colony. Was Trinidad a colony? I'm trying to be very politically.
No.
Correct,
you make a very, very important observation. My American journalistic colleagues always teased me about the fact. They said, "Why did you cross this large continent of America and go all the way to England?" London was the metropolitan center. It's where it's all happened. We were brought up as thoroughgoing colonists, or people who lived in the colonies. We knew much more about, Drake and Raleigh and Trafalgar Square and, Waterloo and Nelson and the few who did so much for so many than we did about West Indian or American history for that matter. So we were drawn to the metropolitan capital. We were a colony and London was the center. And so we all aspired to go there. I mean, it's geographically strange, but that's what happened.
And was it odd that at that age, your one ambition? I mean, this is in a world where cricket is such a huge thing, and everyone. I'm always convinced that everyone's surely growing up there. Their first dream must be to be a cricketer, and then when they get to 14, 15, aren't good enough, then they think of other things. But you seem to be quite keen on being exactly what you became from an early age.
I discovered very early on what, if you have any kind of scintilla of wisdom, that you have to sort of decide what you can do well. I was not going to be Clive Lloyd or Viv Richards or Richie Richardson or anybody like that. I was not good enough. And so I listened to the BBC World Service, and I was quite attracted by the fact that, there were people who were going to Moscow and to Beijing and to New Delhi and Johannesburg, and they were all reporting on big international events. They had a front seat at these events. And that it also occurred to me that somebody was paying them to do this. And I thought this was not a bad life. And if you were a young boy growing up in the Caribbean, miles away from where all this was happening, you would think that, there was some attraction about that. And it was certainly that for me.
You talk also in the book about your last assignment, I think your last year's time in Washington as Washington correspondent, and the Obama presidency.
Yes.
Coming about. I think that was you left just as he became president, didn't you?
That's right. I covered the inauguration, and I always remember. It was kind of very theatrically dramatic because I left and then went flew to Miami to meet up with one of my documentary colleagues. And went straight off to do a documentary, which was to be a kind of phase of my new life. So yes, but it was a wonderful, wonderful thing to cover the inauguration of Obama. I must confess, I thought I knew America terribly, terribly well. I'd spent a lot of time there. I really, really enjoyed working there. It's a wonderful place to work, and I never ever thought I would see the day when a black man would accede to the presidency of the United States. So it was an amazing time to be there. And, for me, quite unforgettable.
Well, bearing that in mind, how have you viewed the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, I've been terribly, terribly lucky to be able to be given a chance to go. Again, around the world, I've done in the Mediterranean and in the, in the Far East and in the Caribbean and in America, in prisons in America, particularly, and with the mafia in America, opening my mind to things that I never thought I would ever dip into. And I say that because I have never been to a prison in the United Kingdom. I had a friend who was who got what was in trouble and who got there, and I'm terribly ashamed of the fact that I never went. I have a fear of prisons and incarceration, and yet I did a number of documentaries about prisons in America, and I found them terribly enlightening and realized just what I had missed for so long, because these people were interesting and they had interesting slices of life to talk about. And so I learned a lot doing those documentaries, and I hugely enjoy them.
I'm jumping around a lot now, but it's just the way it is on this show. News at 10. I don't think today, with 24-hour rolling news as it is, I don't think people really understand what News at 10 represented to people who were there at the time, because it was the flagship. Because the newspapers had what had happened yesterday.
Yeah.
But the news then had to come, as it happened during the day. There was no rolling news. And so at 10 o'clock, the news was on. It was as simple as that. What's happening in the world?
Yes.
Well, we'll find out at 10 o'clock. Trevor McDonald will tell us what has happened. How did that feel to be fronting that?
I felt absolutely honored to be able to do it, and also absolutely terrified. Terrified because just the thing that you said, there was what has been generally described as an appointment to view. And people actually, turned on at 10 o'clock, as you say, to find out what was going on. And I took it very, very, very seriously. Some people used to say to me, oh, you only have a job of about sort of, an hour or half an hour at night. I was in there at 11 o'clock in the morning, attending the meetings and trying to decide not only what we did, but how we did what we did. How do you interest somebody in Norfolk or somebody in Scotland about what is going on in Moscow or in Syria or in Delhi or in Johannesburg? How do you make it interesting enough to involve them? And so we took it terribly, terribly seriously. And I was very, very honored. And when I joined News at 10, it had already become, as you described it, as the flagship. And there were a list of, great honorable names of people who did it. And I was just so chuffed to be part of that.
And it was, again, when I say it was difficult for people to understand because there's so much news now, it was the veracity was the most important part. It never occurred to someone, it never occurred to you that you might not be being told the whole truth, that this news might be edited to suit any particular set of circumstances. Once it was out there, once you'd said it, it was just totally accepted. Is there a worry now? I'll tell you what I'm sort of leading to, because I'd love your opinion on this. I have a great worry now as I get older and my kids, I've got 24-hour news and people like that. The difference between facts and opinions are so blurred.
Yes, I totally agree with you, and I think that is one of the great sadnesses of our time, and the prominence of social media, and the fact that there are multiplicity of channels now from which you can get your news. And as we were saying earlier, in the days of News at 10 at its height, that was an appointment to view at 10 o'clock every evening, or in the BBC's case, at 9 o'clock every evening, or whatever it was. Now, there are many, many more, channels from which you can get your news. And I think it's great that, people can be informed in so many ways, but I think it has its failures. And I think what has been happening recently in the United States demonstrates that. You can find, channels of information which are in fact alternative truth, which are not really checked to be accurate, which are not always correct, and which can be totally misleading. There is an enormous amount of disinformation around, and that is the difficulty today about separating what is truth, what is real, from what is not reality, and from what is misinformation.
And it's something you talk about also quite early in the book, and this makes it even more confusing. Because there is disinformation out there, it now becomes very, very easy for people like, for instance, the outgoing president to blame everything on fake news. Because if there was no fake news, then people would say, we don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean it's fake news? But because we know that some fake news does exist, it's very easy to then say anything I don't agree with, to say, oh, yeah, no, that's fake news.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And we've seen this, as you say, with the outgoing president of the United States, who seemed to have dwelt in a great volume of misinformation and managed to convince, a huge section of the American public that he won the election, when in fact he obviously and quite clearly and quite discernibly lost. But, there were the channels available to him to say that he hadn't lost, and that people must march on the Capitol and protest of the fact that somebody else was being sworn in a job that he should be continuing to do. You're absolutely right. It's a great, great, great problem of the day.
Now that you're, I'm sorry, this sounds like a sort of a testament. Now that you sit and watch what's going on, how do you feel about the world compared to when you start, at Trinidad, when you were obviously, I want to get out there, I want to see what's happening with the news. Does it still hold the same appeal to you?
It does. Especially the last week, I must confess I've lost a lot of sleep watching what has been going on in America, and I'm still always interested in what happens. I've had the great, great good fortune to travel to many parts of the world. I'm fascinated about what happens in Moscow because I've worked there. I'm fascinated about what happens in the Far East because I had a chance to go there, in Hong Kong, in India, in Latin America. I spent a great, great deal of time and enjoyed it hugely to be in America, and I'm still hooked. And my kids tease me about the fact that I'm still, so clearly fascinated and interested by in what happens in the rest of the world. I can't shake that off. It's been a part of my life. I've enjoyed it hugely, and I'm still, very, very interested in what happens.
So I keep talking about the book. The book, of course, is Trevor McDonald, An Improbable Life, the autobiography, which is out. Do you know what? This is how terrible. I can't read the. Yes, I can. It's Wiedenfield and Nicholson, and my eyesight is getting so bad. I'm sorry, Wiedenfield Nicholson. There are two little things, if you don't mind, I want to talk about. Is it Venezuela that the people in the boats wanted to get to, or dreamed of getting to?
Well, they dreamed of getting to Venezuela. Venezuela has one of the biggest oil reserves in the world. Little Trinidad had oil, but it was a tiny, tiny country. And the problem about Venezuela, well, not the problem, but the fact about Venezuela was that it was on the continental shelf, if you like, of a larger, much larger, South America. And my Trinidadian colleagues felt if they could, by luck and by great, great chance, get to Venezuela, if they didn't make it there, they could find probably a home or refuge somewhere in the rest of a vast continent. And so that desire to travel to other parts of the world was always part of what, Trinidadians wanted to do. And I remember, with great, great fondness and in some sense amazement that people were prepared to make that trip in such, uninspiring and uncertain auspices, where were they going to land? Some didn't even speak very good Spanish.
You describe it so beautiful. You say, I remember sitting on the sand under the palm tree, listening to these men with these huge plans of a new life that was based on the 3 phrases of Spanish that they'd learned. And then said, most of them, of course, who'd never owned a boat in their lives.
I know. They would steal the boat and when their owners were asleep. And I mean, it just goes to show. And I mean, it's a great indication of what people would do to find a new life. We see it now. All these people coming from North Africa and going to Italy, and trying to cross, and the people trying to get across the channel in choppy waters to come to the UK. We see this urge to do something to better their life. It's in fact a story of the world, of people desperately trying to do everything to improve the way that they lived.
The book is a lovely book, Improbable, but all the way through it, your warmth shines through. I'm going to ask you for one other story, which I've found absolutely hilarious. You've come from Trinidad. You're now in the UK. You're in London, and you have an incredible job where you travel all over the world to see the great leaders of the world and to comment on the great events. But you would often turn up at Heathrow on the day before the Trinidad.
I know what you're going to say.
Just tell us that.
I know. Well, I'm traveling around the world. Trinidadians have a fascination about the Trinidad Carnival, which is beyond anything that I could adequately express. They thought we had the best carnival in the world. It was the best festival in the world. And I would turn up at Heathrow around the time of Carnival, and they would all look at me and think, how wonderful, you coming down for Carnival, which is the expression, coming down for Carnival. And I would say, no, I'm off to Beirut. And they would look at me with the greatest feeling of pity and incomprehension. And they would think, what on earth would get this misguided person to choose Beirut over Port of Spain and Carnival? And I've always remembered that. And, sometimes I think that they probably were right and I was wrong. Maybe Trinidad Carnival would have been a much better choice than Beirut.
So, Trevor, it's a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. Trevor McDonald, An Improbable Life, Wiedenfield and Nicholson. There you go. I put me better glasses on now. Thank you so much for joining us.